Hello, everyone, and welcome back to World War II History and Stories. I'm Ron May, your host. Today, we continue with our focus on children and war by considering another fascinating story. This one from Poland. Eva Benirska Hermacinski was 10 years old when the war broke out in her homeland of Poland. She and her family struggled to survive those tumultuous years as her country was split between the invading Germans from the west and the Soviets from the east. With her father's assistance, she and her sister eventually escaped Soviet Poland at the war's conclusion. Here is her dramatic story. At the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Europe had already been reeling from 2 years of war, which had begun on September 1st, 1939, when Adolf Hitler sent Nazi troops to defeat sovereign Poland. Eva was born 10 years prior to that invasion, on May 30th, 1929, in the city of Lwow, Poland. Today, the city is Lviv and is located in the Ukraine. Eva was the eldest of 2 daughters raised by her parents. She had a younger sister, Helena, who was 2 years her junior. In the early years of Eva's life, Poland was still enjoying peace and security. The Benirski family experienced many parts of their homeland, as they moved repeatedly during Eva's childhood. Her family spent a few years in the city of Lodz in central Poland, before they moved to Grodno in northern Poland, where her father found work at a Polish tobacco industry. In 1934, the family moved again. This time they settled in Poznan in northwestern Poland, where her father again worked for a tobacco company. In March 1939, 6 months before Germany invaded Poland, Eva's father moved the family to Warsaw to accept a job at an airplane factory. At her birth, Eva's country, Poland, was still youthful in national resurrection, only 11 years into its second life as a nation. Poland's autonomy lasted for barely 20 years before the Nazi invasion of 1939 brought a new and tragic chapter of foreign occupation. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler's Nazi army invaded Western Poland and ignited a war in Europe. Eva, 10 years old at the time, recalled that nobody expected that the Germans would be able to advance as quickly as they did. Our brave Polish cavalry was no match for German tanks. On September 3rd, 2 days after the war began, Eva recalled the following. My father went to work, but came back home shortly and told my mother to leave everything, take Helena and me, and follow him. We ran down a couple of streets full of people to my father's car. We got in the car and started driving out of the city. The roads were packed with trucks, cars, horse-driven wagons, and people on foot. We eventually got out of the city with the roads still full of people. All of a sudden, I saw some small airplanes flying near us and shooting from their machine guns into the crowds below. Eva's family joined a convoy of vehicles and people heading east, away from the German forces advancing from the west. Once the Benirski family got out of the immediate path of the advancing Germans, Eva's father led them south, back to her birthplace in Lwow. Fearing that the city might be bombed, the family proceeded into the country and arrived at a large farm owned by Eva's mother's parents. Eva's father then proceeded with some other Poles from the airplane factory that he worked at in Warsaw to smuggle airplane parts from their factory into neighboring Romania. They expected to be gone for just a few days. They never returned. Germany's Blitzkrieg, or lightning campaign, took only 35 days to defeat Poland. Western Poland was defeated by the Germans, and Eastern Poland came under Soviet occupation. This arrangement was part of the secret protocol in the Soviet-Nazi Non-Aggression Pact of August 23, 1930, otherwise known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named for the respective foreign ministers of each country. Eva's mother decided it was too risky for the women and girls to remain on the farm. She arranged for them to be taken back to town on a horse-driven wagon. We moved into the tiny one-bedroom apartment where most of us slept on the floor, Eva recalled. There was no heating. The food was very scarce, and there were long lines to buy anything. The weather was very cold, and we had no winter clothes. Alarm increased even further when Eva's mother realized that the Russians had begun evicting residents from the apartments and deporting them to slave labor camps in Russia. The sudden opening of the German embassy in Lviv provided an opportunity for Eva and her family to return to German-occupied Poland from where they had initially fled. Combat operations had been concluded, and Germany was now occupying the western part of Poland while the Soviet Union occupied the eastern part. As the Russians had historically been considered the Poles' worst enemies, the Benirska women figured German occupation would be more tolerable than ending up in Siberia. Their new destination was Krakow, on the south border of Poland, where Eva's mother had some friends who offered to host them in one of the rooms of their apartment. Eva, her mother, and her sister Helena, along with some other extended family, managed to etch out a new life in Krakow. It was difficult, but at least they were together. When Eva turned 13, she had to find a job in Krakow or risk getting sent to Germany as a laborer. Her salvation came from the strangest of places, a laboratory in Krakow that raised lice. Polish scientist Rudolf Wiegel had begun injecting lice with typhoid germs for the purpose of producing an anti-typhoid vaccine for German forces. Eva learned that the institute needed feeders for the lice. She and many other women became feeders. Considered an essential position, it guaranteed she would not be sent to Germany for labor. Eva explained the daily process. Twice a day I would go to the institute. They would give me my tray with 24 or so small rectangular wooden boxes, each with 2 round openings covered with very fine metal mesh. There were hundreds of tiny lice inside. We would strap these boxes around our thighs and calves and sit for 30 minutes, trying hard not to scratch while the lice were feasting. At first, the itching was unbearable. When the session was finished and I took the cages off, my legs were full of big red circles. After a few months, I got used to that. It was a good job. I had time to study, help a little at home, and the family thought me a hero. Meanwhile, some of the Polish had been organizing resistance against the German occupation. Eva recalled, the Poles were setting up their resistance in the form of a secret army known as the Armia Krajowa. My mother was an active member. We often had AK activists staying in our home overnight. One time, when our home was searched, they escaped by jumping from the balcony onto the roof of the next house. The Armia Krajowa had been organized in February of 1942 to resist the German occupation by sabotage and direct combat operations. As time passed, the Soviet Red Army advanced across eastern Poland and into western Poland, progressively pushing the Wehrmacht back to Germany. By January of 1945, the Red Army was occupying most of Poland. While the Russian takeover of Krakow was mostly peaceful, it was clear that the city was now under Soviet rule. We were not a free Poland, Eva acknowledged. The Russians brought with them the Polish communist government. The borders were closed. You could not leave the country. The fall of 1945 brought Eva and her sister both good news and bad news. The good news pertained to her father. All through those years, we had not known anything of my father, where he could be, if he was alive, Eva shared. Eva's father had escaped from Poland to Romania, smuggling those airplane parts. Unable to return to Poland, he joined the Polish army in exile and fought in France before escaping to England and going to Scotland, where he entered a relocation camp. He lost touch with his wife and children for several years. Then one day, Eva recalled, someone came to our house and brought us a package with several yards of beautiful woolen fabric to make coats for us for the winter, and said that it was from our father. All of us were thrilled to know that he was alive and that we would see him again. The thrill of their father's well-being, however, was soon followed by the agony of their mother's sudden death. Eva's mom periodically traveled by train from Krakow to Warsaw to bring essential food and supplies to the remaining residents there. Warsaw had been razed by the Germans following the Warsaw Uprising in August through September of 1944. Eva shared, "On Sunday, October 7th, 1945, Mom left Krakow on the train to Warsaw, transporting big containers of fruit. On Monday morning, my uncle saw in the newspaper that there was a train accident on the Krakow to Warsaw line. He left immediately and found that indeed there was an accident. 2 trains collided with one another, and 7 people were killed. One of them was our mother. A heavy suitcase had fallen on her head." Eva and Helena were devastated. But their lives went on with the support of extended family and the hope of being reunited again with their father. Back in Scotland, Eva's father had been arranging to smuggle his daughters out of communist Poland. Posing as refugees returning to Belgium, the girls traveled secretly to Germany and then waited 10 weeks, alone and scared, for their father to finally meet them there. Eva recalled, "Both of us cried as we tried to console one another. This was the worst time in all my life." Sometime in July, the girls received a letter from their father stating that he would be arriving to get them the following week. "When the day arrived," Eva said, "we were taken to the nearby town where there was an officers' club. We were excited and a bit worried, not knowing what our father would look like and whether he would recognize us. But when we walked in and saw him, we knew each other, and we were crying and laughing at the same time." The father and daughters, who had not seen each other for 6 years, were finally reunited. Together they traveled to England and proceeded to Edinburgh, Scotland, to begin the next chapter of their lives. Following her high school graduation in Edinburgh, Eva applied and was accepted at Dublin University in Ireland. After graduating from there, she saw a flyer on campus advertising a position teaching English classes at a school of languages in Madrid, Spain. Eva wrote to them about her interest in the position, and she was offered the job. She taught English classes to 7 adults at the Instituto Riam, and later taught kindergarten children as well. In 1955, Eva was contacted by the U.S. Embassy in Liverpool, informing her that her immigration application had come through for traveling to the United States. Back in 1946, Eva, her sister, and her father had all applied to go to America. Now, 9 years later, the opportunity was finally upon her. But by this time, her father was busy with running an engineering business in England, and her sister had also settled down in England. Eva decided to come to America by herself. After working for a time in New York City, she traveled out to Los Angeles to visit a cousin and to work at the Los Angeles Times. While working for the Los Angeles Times, Eva met her future husband, James Hermacinski, an American Polish citizen. They later married in 1958. Their lives were kept busy raising their 5 children in Los Angeles and later in Chicago. In 1978, Eva's father had a stroke and was dying. She went to England to be with him and her sister. Following his death, she decided to remain in England to manage Loonside Engineering, the machine shop her father had started in 1958 in the Loon River Valley near Lancaster, England. The shop, which employed 100 people, made small precision components for major manufacturers. Eva's 3 sons joined her in England, while Jim and their daughters remained in the United States. After Jim retired, he joined Eva in England. In 1994, Eva sold her father's business, and she and Jim returned to the United States. In retirement, Jim and Eva lived in Arizona and then later in South Carolina. Jim died in 2012 at the age of 83. He and Eva had enjoyed 53 years together. In 2017, Eva moved to a senior community in Zionsville, Indiana, to be closer to one of her sons. She has remained active there. In 2022, she completed the project of writing her life story for the members of her family. Hers has been a life filled with survival, loss, adventure, love, longevity, health, and happiness. A lifelong devout Roman Catholic, there is but one more journey she wishes to take and one more country she wishes to live: heaven. She looks forward to God ushering her there when the time comes. You can read more about Eva's story in my book, Our Service, Our Stories, Volume 3. Thanks for tuning in today. Join me next time as I share the story of Janet Mackenzie, who grew up in England during the war years. She was evacuated, along with thousands of other children, after the British and French declared war on Germany, and as they anticipated, combat on their homeland. She later returned to London and was a communications messenger during some of those bombing blitzes from the German Luftwaffe. She later joined the Royal Navy and served her country until the end of World War II. See you next time.